Hi, I'm Ed Dorn. Thanks very much for joining William Abranowicz and me. Later, I think we'll be joined by Nikole Hannah-Jones, and we are here to talk about William's very beautiful and very important book of photographs entitled This Far and No Further. William Abranowicz is a photographer of some renown. His works have been uh, uh, acquired by the National Portrait Galleries of the United States and the United Kingdom, by the Getty Museum, by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and uh, his current work uh, is about the long struggle over freedom and, most importantly, over voting rights. William, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Question
Thank you for
one.
having me.
Question one, William. Why did you do this project?
I did it. I was on a commercial assignment. I'm a commercial photographer primarily, and I was on assignment in Lowndes County, Alabama. I was about 40 minutes from Selma, and on a break I went to Selma and spent a little time walking through the town and walking over the Pettus Bridge, which in and of itself is a very moving experience for me. And I'm a great fan of Walker Evans's work. Walker Evans, an American photographer who worked in the 1930s for the Works Progress Administration, documenting throughout the South, primarily poverty. And the photographs that he made in Selma in the 1930s, those photographs, the town appeared to be relatively unchanged. And that to me, this mix of history and emotion and material ignited something in me, and I started reading and realized how little I knew, and wound up going back to Selma a month later to begin this project, naively begin this project. And I say naively because, my white privilege sort of held me, protected me from the realities of the violence. And it didn't take, I read John Lewis's Walking with the Wind, and it didn't take very long to realize, this history was repeating itself. We had the 2013 removal of the change in the Voting Rights Act, and then with the election of a new administration in 2016, this really full frontal attack on voting rights and voting suppression. So in outrage, again, naive outrage, I started this project and decided to follow the footsteps first of the Selma to Montgomery march from Marion to Selma to Montgomery. And then I took it, I started to cover various points of history, starting with slavery. So it was naivety.
I have another question, but before I do, I want to provide an alert to those who have joined us in the audience. I want to engage you as early as possible in this. So in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to start looking for your questions. And with that alert, Bill, let me turn back to you, because while the book is largely about voting rights, you begin in a very different place, and in a very gruesome place. And I wonder if you can explain to us why you began this book as you began it.
Yeah, I guess I'll go to some of the images now. Just give me a second. I'm going to go to a screen share here, which will take me just a second. See, I'm hoping I'm doing this right because I've never done this before. Are you seeing my screen?
I'm seeing part one, Mortal Sin.
Okay, so
And there we
There we go.
are.
Okay, so cover the book. Sorry, the Tallahatchie River
Hmm.
in Greenwood, which we can come back to. But part one is mortal sin, and I'll talk about mortal sin. But this is the first photograph, the frontispiece of the book, which is a photograph from Liberty Square in Charleston, South Carolina. 40% of the enslaved people who were brought to America passed through this port at which is now Liberty Square. And this photograph is part of a display at Liberty Square. And I was bowled over by the fact that there were so many children in this image, you know, and I know all these things. I know about slavery. I knew about enslaved people. I never had a clue that there were so many children involved from the beginning. You know, by 1860, 56% of enslaved people, 56% of the 4 million people in slavery had basically spent their childhood in that state. So the poignancy of that to me was really quite powerful. So I decided it's mortal. I grew up Catholic. I'm not very religious, but the tenets of the Catholic Church talk about mortal sin. Mortal sin being the gravest of sins, murder, which was considered a murder which was considered and being thrown out of the graces of God, that could only be corrected through a reconciliation. And so I decided to title the first, the more historical part of the book, A Mortal Sin.
Okay, thank you. Delighted that Nikole Hannah-Jones has been able to join us. Many of us became familiar with Nikole Hannah-Jones as a result of the 1619 project, for which she won a Pulitzer Prize. But she was an accomplished journalist before that. As a matter of fact, she was awarded a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship in 2017 for her extensive work on the continuing and pervasive role of race in American society. Nicole, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you. And I apologize for being late. Technical difficulties. My computer crashed and it took me a minute to get it booted back up. So I apologize.
I understand. I asked William at the beginning how he became involved in this. And I want to ask you the same question, because I'm sure, given your prominence, people approach you all the time to support or endorse their projects. Why do you endorse this one?
Yeah, thank you. So I got an email one day and it talked about, it was from William, and he was talking about this project that he was working on and wanted to know if I would write a foreword to it. And you're right, I don't, mostly I'm not able to accommodate most requests just because I simply don't have the time. And I will certainly never write a foreword or blurb a book that I haven't actually read. So oftentimes I just can't say yes, even to things that I would love to say yes to. But he sent me some photos. I asked to see kind of some of the photos and what was the book really going to be about. And it just struck me. And this photo we're looking at right here, of course, is the Yazoo River, right where my father was born, on a sharecropping farm in Greenwood, Mississippi, not too far from where Emmett Till was killed and thrown into the river. So there was just something about the images and in some ways how mundane they were that spoke to me about how mundane the violence and terrorism that white Americans used to suppress Black people was, that this was just a part of daily life, that there wasn't, we kind of expect these spots where atrocities happen to be marked in some way, but often they just exist in our landscape, and they're very innocuous. We can walk past them every day and not think about what happened there. And I think that is a forced forgetting, and it's a convenient forgetting. So these images just spoke to me, and what William was trying to do really spoke to me as well.
Well, your mention of things in the landscape maybe leads us to some of the other wonderful photographs in the first section. Belle, can you just continue with that?
Yeah. This is a photograph of two water fountains at a shop in Beale Street in Memphis, Tennessee. It's on a sort of second floor landing between floors. And it's one of those things that you'd walk by. I think most people would walk by this could walk by it 1,000 times and not sort of understand what it was. And to me, it just was a sanitized but very potent symbol of what existed in terms of segregation. And this is the Sloss Furnace, which is now a cultural arts center in Birmingham, Alabama. Sloss was founded by a Confederate general in the late 1800s. Birmingham was one of the largest industrial town in the South, and it wasn't the pay was low. There were anti-union efforts were stringent and strident. There was a lot of violence, and when it was sold later, that continued. The intimidation against organizing continued. And there are a lot of Black Americans that worked here rather, and as well as white. And it became, this sort of peonage that exists with unpaid labor, unpaid convict labor, still continues in some states. Again, and it also the steel industry also was the first time that Black America and the unions sort of started to come together. They started to talk about the parallels in each of their struggles, which were again resuscitated in the 1960s with Robert Kennedy and Walter Luther. This is the outside of Medgar Evers, the Evers family home in Jackson, Mississippi. Small little street, small little house. And Nicole in the 1619 project talks about something in Mississippi, in the air, in the water, in the soil, that you cannot help but feel the history. I arrived in Jackson. I drove to the Evers home, and Medgar Evers was shot in the back by a white supremacist in this driveway as he exited his car with his children inside on the evening that John Kennedy, in June 1963, an evening that John Kennedy had given a major civil rights speech. It's now a museum, and when I was 8 years old, I remember I started to became politically aware of what was going on. I don't know how, but I remember these shoes. I remember the story of these shoes from when I was 8 years old. They're Buster Brown shoes. I wore Buster Brown shoes. Denise McNair was 14 years old when she was one of the 4 children that were killed in a bombing by the Klan in 1963. These shoes are part of a permanent display at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And to me, these shoes are perhaps one of the most powerful symbol of what we did. And there's an amazing, if the audience hasn't read Eugene Patterson was an editor at the Atlanta Constitution in 1963, and he wrote an editorial called "A Flower for the Graves" about these 4 girls and how that white Southerners held these shoes in their hands and were responsible. It wasn't just the Klan. Claiborne Temple, which is in Memphis, Tennessee, which was the site of organizing with the Memphis sanitation workers strike. 2 sanitation workers were killed in February of 1968. Protests started. The meetings would take place here and march, and usually met with violence for the next 4 months or so as protests occurred. The day I went to photograph this, I go to a place and I try to I don't have a preconceived notion. I try to make a photograph of a place, and I had spent the morning in the rain trying to photograph the exterior to no avail. And I went back that afternoon. I was a little down because I wasn't successful, and I heard this incredible music coming from the interior. It was the Stax Foundation students who were rehearsing for the year-end performance. And I don't think I have ever heard a more remarkable group of kids. Here it is, this temple, which I believe has now been restored, was the site of such joy when I visited it.
Nicole, before we move on to part 2, any reaction to the Buster Brown shoes or that dark, foreboding river? And you're muted, Nicole.
Of course, you have to do that at least one time on these talks, right? Yeah, I was just saying that the images are so haunting again in how ordinary they are. When I went down to Mississippi to write about my dad's hometown for the anniversary of Freedom Summer, and I also spent time in Jackson, and the man who killed Medgar Evers, of course, just lived in town in Greenwood for decades after that. And I interviewed a local civil rights worker in Greenwood, not one of those folks who came down south and then went back home, but one who lived in Greenwood and had to deal with the consequences once everyone else had returned and gone back to college. And he had been shot in the face by the same man who killed Medgar Evers, and survived, but had still the scars in his mouth. And we talked about what that meant to have to live as Black people in a place where the people who terrorized you, the people who were assassinating your leaders, just walked freely around and were able to keep you from jobs, able to keep you from going in certain parts of town. Many of them ended up having to somehow try to work for themselves. And so when I see Medgar Evers' house, he was carrying voting T-shirts when he was shot. And you just see this legacy, this connection to the ongoing efforts today, still to control who can vote, who can cast a ballot, who are legitimate, and often also that same tendency towards violence, which of course we saw at the insurrection. And the last thing I'll say quickly, I have a 10-year-old daughter, and when she was very young, I spent a month reporting in Tuscaloosa, and I moved, it was in the summer, I moved her down there with me, and we went to the church, and we went to the museum in Birmingham, and try to explain to a child why grown people would choose to kill other children. Simply for trying to get their rights, and these children simply for just being in a church, a house of God. And that's when you realize what terrorism is really like, when you try to explain to your child how she could have been killed simply for existing as a Black girl in this country. So that's everything I was thinking as I was looking at those images.
I understand. Bill, before we move on to redemption, part 2, we have a question from Evelyn Ryan, who has a question about how you do your art.
How I
When
do
you
my
know what place or person you want to photograph, what is the process you follow to find and get the shot you want? Do you have to return to a place multiple times?
I try not to. I try not to return to a place multiple times. Reaction is photographers. I think like a writer, a reaction. Photography is a spontaneous art. You have an instantaneous reaction, and you simply have to set a camera up. And depending on the type of camera you're using, you have to hold on to that feeling of spontaneity. At least that's the way I work. So I will sometimes go back, but I try to avoid it.
Okay.
I try to go and feel something immediately. And a lot of what I did throughout this book, you cannot help but stand on this soil and not feel something. It is impossible. I don't know how someone could possibly do it, because I just felt so much. I was aware of the history, but it's I depend on that, and my tech, and the craft of photography to me is very important. So technically, I want it to be perfect. That would be a reason I would go back if technically it wasn't.
Okay, let's move on to part 2 of your book,
Right,
Redemption.
redemption. Yeah, redemption in the religious sense and in the post-Reconstruction sense. Like the title, This Far and No Further, which is from the Bible and from James Baldwin. Redemption is is a section in the book where I started to, develop the lifting up. This is not, it is done somewhat historically, sequentially in the book. This is the Dexter Avenue Church in Montgomery, Alabama, where Martin Luther King was pastor from 1954 to 1960. Many of the organizing meetings for the Montgomery bus boycott took place here. The thing, and I think Nicole, the thing I was surprised about in a place like Greenwood and in a place like Montgomery is how small it is. The Dexter Avenue Church is a block from the Montgomery State Capitol. And, I have a pickup truck and I drive from location to location to location. In Montgomery, I was walking from spot to spot. It's a magnificent church. It's a real attraction, and played a very important role in the civil rights movement. The Edmund Pettus Bridge, probably the most famous. The Edmund Pettus Bridge is small. It's a 15-foot high arch, and when I walked, I think I met 2 German tourists, and I imagined these 20-year-olds, 21-year-old John Lewis, walking in a line through this very tight space between the girders. It's a surprisingly small space, and to reach the apex where they saw the blue helmets of the Alabama State Troopers waiting to pummel them, to prevent them from marching to the Capitol. And the Pettus Bridge, to stand on this bridge 52 years after Bloody Sunday, 2 years after, or a few years after President Obama had walked over it. So to stand on it, it was powerful. I mean, there was one powerful moment after another. Congressman John Lewis, the boy from Troy, and Route 80, which is the path that the marchers from Selma took from Selma to Montgomery. This photograph was taken in Lowndes County, which was known as Bloody Lowndes in the 1960s. Saw a lot of violence targeting anyone who dare spoke of voting, spoke of registering voters, spoke of registering as a voter. And John Lewis, of course, the the famous civil rights hero. And I'm going to take this opportunity to make sure you call your senator in your state, wherever you are, and see to it that Senate Bill 1, the John Lewis Senate Bill 1 and For the People Act is passed. It's the greatest honor we could possibly give this wonderful human.
Well, here's my coffee cup tribute to John Lewis.
There it is. Yeah,
good trouble.
Good trouble.
Cole, observations, thoughts?
Yeah, I have right behind me, John Lewis sits over my right shoulder every time I give one of these talks. I was honored as a journalist to get to meet him and interview him when I was reporting on Freedom Summer. And yeah, I think when you see this image in particular, it's so powerful and heart-wrenching because we lost him. Without him being able to convince his colleagues to actually stand up for voting rights. And when you think about all of those senators who came to his funeral and who said such great words about him upon his death, who are now standing back as a wave of laws are being introduced to roll back further the protections that he nearly gave his life for. It's unconscionable, but I think what it also shows is the battles are never won. We will always have to fight. And as we lose people like John Lewis, others have stepped up and will have to continue to step up. But I agree with William. Sometimes we have these talks and people want to know what can they do. And when you're writing about systemic racism, it seems like a hard question to answer because most people aren't willing to really do what's necessary. But this is a very small and easy thing to do, right, which is to call your senator and apply that pressure.
Yeah. Yeah. This photo. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, Bill. Here's a question from Ava Anderson Jenkins. What kind of reaction did you get from some of the citizens you interacted with when they learned the purpose of your project?
I
take it she's talking. I take it she's talking about some of the Southern whites with whom you engaged.
You know, I have found the Southern whites that disagreed with what I was doing simply remained silent. You know, I found I work a lot with clients in the South, and some just stopped contacting me. You know, but you know, that's not a bad thing. You know, and I want to point out too that this photograph of John Lewis was made in his office in Washington, D.C. on the 50th anniversary of Robert Kennedy's assassination, and the congressman was at the Ambassador Hotel when that happened. You know, and the
why don't we move along?
Yeah. So revival.
Part 3, revival.
Part 3, revival. Reverend William Barber and Reverend Liz Theo-Harris. Reverend Barber and Theo-Harris are co-chairs of the Newport People's Campaign, which was begun a few years ago to continue the work that Dr. King had laid out in Marks, Mississippi in 1968 after witnessing the intense poverty of that area. I believe as a sort of lapsed Catholic, I grew up in with an understanding of that we are responsible for taking care of people, you know, and it's the Darcy Day School of Social Justice in Catholicism, and neither of these reverends are Catholics, but you know, the moral agenda. The statement "Jesus was a poor man" to me resounded to me, and both Reverend Barber and Theo-Harris wear these stalls. It was everything we do. If the right to vote is made free and easy for everyone, I think a lot of the problems that we have can be solved. Again, I speak from a naive point of view, but I do believe that, you know, the arc of the universe will bend towards the moral, you know. And so these two, to me, really stood out in contemporary work. Brian Stevenson and of the Equal Justice Initiative and the Memorial for Peace and Justice, which has the Memorial for Peace and Justice has had the same effect on me that the Vietnam Veterans Memorial had the first time I saw it, where, you know, it doesn't move, you move around it, and it changes. And the humanity that is expressed, and there's nothing of that humanity that is expressed in this memorial is like none that I have ever seen. And Mr. Stevenson says that if you care about people who are marginalized, if you care about the poor, the excluded, the disabled, then you have to vote. So there's in the revival section, there are a number of people who are doing work along Catherine Flowers in Lowndes County, Alabama, working with sanitation, which is a serious problem throughout the South, and other people who are using the vote to move along these different agendas, or depending on the vote, to move along different agendas along environmental justice, or all social justice issues. And this is Cherylin Ifill, who is the executive director of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund. Very much in the news right now with voting rights and the what's going on in the state of Georgia. But I know, you know, the NAACP is one of the various arms that has moved as a large, you know, this wave that has gone on in civil and voting rights. This wave has continued for hundreds of years. You know, my book is a primer on the events. There are millions of people involved in this, and it has happened throughout a very long period of time. You know, Thurgood Marshall held this position, the position that Ms. Ifill holds. Constance Baker Motley was an attorney. Isaac Woodard's, the returning veteran who was blinded after the police beat him in Georgia, was represented by the NAACP. So they're doing, you know, valuable work. That's probably not as radical as many organizations, you know, I shouldn't say radical. That is, you know, there are a lot of different tactics. The NAACP's legal tactics are, you know, have been around a long time and have made, you know, a substantial difference. And this is a woman who is a docent at the International Museum of Civil Rights in Greensboro, North Carolina. Her name is Robin Easter. She's a singer, she's a performer, and she's still like air rises. She taught me on a tour that I did when I was first starting the book. She taught me about Joanne Robinson. You know, we learn the same things, the same few things in American history, and people like Robin Easter are teaching people about the other parts of history, the history that hopefully the 1619 Project will be bringing into everybody's home soon. And Robin Easter is a symbol of the women. You know, one of the things that, you know, we know Martin Luther King, you know, Bayard Rustin, and we know all of the male civil rights heroes. The women, Septima Clark, Ella Baker, Nicole, this whole long line of women who did so much of the work and whose names most of us don't know. So I wanted to pay some homage to that because women in the educational and you know, and the organizing aspects and the marching aspects were right on par, and not enough is said.
Bill, here's a challenging question. It goes as follows. This book is beautiful and moving, but with the question of ownership of stories so prevalent at this time, did you have any thoughts or reservations about why you should be the photographer telling this story?
Yeah. There are 3 books out currently by photographers on the same topic, each of them from a different point of view. It was a very, very big concern of mine. And I photographed Harry Belafonte as part of this project. I was supposed to have about 10 minutes with Mr. Belafonte to make the photograph. He invited me to dinner and we spent 3 hours talking. And I asked him about, what do you do about this? It's American history. There is an ownership. This history it refers to Eugene Patterson's Flowers to the Grave. I am responsible for a lot of this history. My ancestors are responsible for a lot of this history. And I want to do what I can to stop it. I want to do what I can to rectify that. It's time for reconciliation, and it's going to come from a lot of different corners. I mean, I think the wave is moving in our favor, but it's not. I have learned that, as I said to Benjamin Salisbury at the Emmett Till Project when I started this, I was outraged. I was outraged that in America, in this democracy, that this happens. It just seemed un-American, I said to him. And he very quickly said, maybe it's very American. He's a Black kid who grew up in Sumner, Mississippi. It's very American.
Nicole, you're familiar with this question because after you produced the 1619 project, a lot of folks, including a fellow named Donald Trump, questioned your authority to tell America's story.
Yeah, what we understand, the work that William is doing, the work that I'm doing, the work that so many historians and writers are doing, it's really about memory. It's not about what happened, because what happened, right? Yeah. Those facts of history occurred. Whether we want to talk about them or not, they occurred and they are shaping our society. But what the fight is really about is which of those facts will we remember, and which of those facts will we say are defining features of our national identity as Americans. So I agree with William that these are American stories. These are not Black stories. And certainly white people had a tremendous role in every photograph, except for the portraits of Black people that are in this book. And we all have to be telling this story. And so when you see the efforts of someone, these stories, these multiple stories, when you see the efforts of someone like Donald Trump, and the conservative legislators that are trying to prohibit the teaching of the 1619 Project or critical race theory, that's about power. And that's about saying who should have the power to shape narratives, right. Who will build those narratives around. And my work is clearly trying to say that different people should have that power to shape a narrative that is a more accurate reflection of who we are. So I applaud really anyone who wants to take on this work. We could never learn enough about this history, frankly. And there could be 10 books out right now, and each one would have a different angle, and each one would teach us something else and cause us to reflect on the country that we have been and the country we still are.
We have about 5 minutes, long enough for a couple more questions, but let me begin by asking each of you where you're going from here. William, you mentioned that you have been a commercial photographer, that this was a kind of a departure from the kind of stuff you usually do. I'm wondering whether you are continuing it. And Nicole, I must ask you, what is the next step in the 1619 project? Because you are turning that into a kind of multimedia enterprise. William, what's next for you?
I actually just came from Ocean City, Maryland, and I'm looking for another project. I always have personal projects that I'm doing apart from my commercial assignments. And I was in a beach town that is off season, and I started photographing and realized these invisible people who are working in these beach towns now, right now in April, getting ready. And I just had a thought to start a project examining that, the hotel workers, the people who clean, the people who fix. It was just an idea I just had. I mean, I'm always working on a couple of different books, but I was fascinated because I grew up on the New Jersey shore, and you never think about. I think about the people who clean the hotel room and who do the work that many people don't want to do. And I just thought it would be a wonderful thing to praise, to give praise to that, these invisible people, because I just think I just had this thought over the last couple of days. And Nicole has a very big project, yeah.
Yeah, I certainly, when I pitched the 1619 project, I had no idea it would completely take over my life, but it's the greatest honor of my career to be able to do something like this. So we are actually next week going to be revealing the covers for the two 1619 books that are publishing this fall. There's an adult book. We've expanded all of the original essays. I've certainly expanded mine to respond quite voraciously to the critics. And we've added 8 new additional essays about different areas in American life that the original project couldn't address. And then I also co-authored a children's book that will be coming out, a 1619 children's book that will be coming out this fall, picture book. And then we're going to start filming on the 1619 documentary series this summer, which will be a 6-part series that will air on Hulu and ABC. So yeah, I have a lot on my plate.
That's great.
Well, I want to thank both of you for being here. William, for producing a very evocative story about race in the United States, and especially about the current struggle over voting rights. As you know, and probably most members of the audience know, this is a full-scale assault on voting rights, launched in legislatures in more than 40 states to date. Literally hundreds of bills, including bills in the state of Texas that would continue a long-term assault that began with purposeful racial gerrymandering around 2005, continued through the voter ID efforts, which got a real push from a Supreme Court decision in 2013, and now the current push to restrict voting hours, to restrict mail-in voting, and so on. It is a real struggle. It is one of the morals of the story is, especially in Texas, that the folks who control this state really, 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 really didn't want Black folks and brown folks to vote, and they are continuing that effort. Thank you very much, and thanks to our audience for its participation in this. Nicole, best wishes. I look forward to the next iterations of the 1619 project.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.